young woman goes to a lake, spends the weekend with friends, drinks, laughs, has a great time. By the next afternoon, she's dead. The explanation is simple. She fell from the campsite into the water below. And that is where the story ends. At least, that's how it's been presented. Because the place where she was sleeping was right there, at the edge. A fall from that position is absolutely possible. That part doesn't create any problems. The problems come in everything that has to come after that fall. Because once you move past the idea of a fall, the explanation doesn't just stop there. It has to explain the outcome, how that fall happened, what it resulted in, how it led to the condition that she was found in, and how she ended up where she was ultimately located. That's where things start to break. Because now, you're not just dealing with one event. You're dealing with a sequence, and that sequence has to hold together, step by step, not just at the beginning, but all the way through. Because this case doesn't just depend on a fall. It depends on everything after that fall happening in a way that matches the evidence. And when you start testing that against the terrain, against the timeline, against the body, you're left with a very different question. Not what happened, but did it happen the way that we were told that it did? Welcome back, listeners, to Dark Dialogue Distilled. I'm your host, John, and this show is where we take a step back, strip a case down to its core, and examine what actually holds up under scrutiny. Now, if you've been following Dark Dialogue, then you've heard us work through cases piece by piece. Distilled is different. This isn't about just telling a story, it's about testing it. Taking what's been said, what's been reported, what's been assumed, and putting it up against the evidence. Because sometimes the story that you're given and what actually happened are not the same thing. And sometimes it's not just one case where it happens. We've seen that before. In Holly's case, where the narrative doesn't line up cleanly with the evidence, we've seen elements of it in other investigations as well, some that I'm working on right now, where conclusions were reached, but the path to those conclusions was not fully established. Not as a claim, not as an accusation, but as a pattern that deserves to be examined. In this case, that difference really matters. Now, we've covered the death of Lauren Agee before, early on. And to be clear, those episodes don't reflect the standard that we're working at now. The audio, the structure, the depth of the analysis, all of it has changed. So this is not a continuation. This is a reset. We're going back to the beginning, and we're working through this case again from the ground up. No assumptions, no shortcuts, just what can be supported and what can't. Because on the surface, this case seems pretty straightforward. A weekend at the lake, a night of drinking, an accidental fall. But as you start pulling that apart, the details don't stay simple. The timeline doesn't stay consistent. The statements don't stay aligned. And the physical evidence doesn't always point in the same direction. Now, this is the first episode in a multi-part breakdown where we take each piece one at a time and test whether it actually fits. Not what we think happened, not what someone said happened, but what the evidence can actually support. Because if the explanation holds, then it should survive that process. And if it doesn't, then we keep going. Lauren Taylor Agee was 21 years old. She was from Tennessee, and like a lot of people that weekend, she was heading to Center Hill Lake for an event called Wakefest. Wakefest is exactly what it sounds like. Boats, crowds, music, drinking, a weekend on the water where people camp along the shoreline or on their houseboats And they moved back and forth between the lake and the marina. And Lauren didn't go alone. She went with her friend, Hannah Palmer. Now, once they arrived at the lake, they met up with two other people, Aaron Lilly and Chris Stout. And the four of them stayed together at a campsite located at the end of a narrow peninsula that extends out into the lake. And that location is important because the terrain there is not flat. It's very uneven. It's heavily wooded. And in some areas, it drops off very sharply into the water below. Now, on the night of July 25th, into the early morning hours of July 26th, the group was at the marina at a bar called Fish Lips. There was drinking, there was activity throughout the area that's consistent with the event, and at approximately 2 a.m., Lauren was seen alive. She was seen leaving the marina with Hannah, Aaron, and Chris, all four of them walking down the dock together. That moment is the last independently confirmed sighting of Lauren Agee alive. Now, what happens after that is where this case begins to break apart. According to the accounts that were given later, the group returned to the campsite. They made their way back by paddling their canoe across the lake, which from somebody from Wyoming is really just a very large river. It matches that more than it really matches a lake, at least in the way that I think of a lake. It's a long, winding lake/river. It has an inlet, several inlets, it looks like, and an outlet. So there's a current that's flowing through this at all times. In order to get to their campsite, they could not walk there. The only way they could get there was by boat. And they couldn't get a houseboat back up into there. The only thing that they could do is take a canoe. So they were taking a canoe across that water to this peninsula and their campsite. And then they climbed back up to that campsite, to the area where they were staying. And at some point after that, they went to sleep. And then after that, Lauren was no longer there. The next morning, she was gone. Her belongings, including her shoes, were still at the campsite. And as the day went on, the group continued to move between the campsite and the lake. And then at approximately 4:30 that afternoon, Lauren's body was found in the water, not far from the area where they had been staying. Her death was ultimately ruled an accident, blunt force trauma with possible drowning. And on the surface, that explanation seems to fit. You have a dangerous environment, a night of drinking, a fall, makes sense. But as we move forward, we're going to take each part of that explanation and we're going to test it because the details do not stay that simple for long. Now, before you can understand what might have happened, you have to understand where it happened because this isn't just a campsite. It's a very specific kind of terrain. And the details of that terrain matter more than they really seem to at first. The group was staying, like I said, out on the end of a very narrow peninsula that extends out into the center of this portion of Center Hill Lake. From above, it looks manageable. But once you're actually there, the reality is very different. The ground isn't flat. It's uneven. It's covered with rocks, roots, brush, and major changes in elevation. And the further out you go, the more exposed it becomes. On one side, there's a very steep drop, a sheer cliff that's estimated at roughly 90 to 100 feet that leads directly into the water below. That side is known for cliff jumping. People were jumping from that area throughout that weekend. And then on the other side, the terrain is very different. It's still steep, but it's more gradual and it's covered in trees, rocks, brush. It's not a clean drop, but not easy to navigate either. In fact, based on the layout, reaching the water from that side from a fall without being slowed or stopped by the terrain would be very difficult, if not impossible. To even move between these areas, you're dealing with uneven footing, elevation changes, obstacles at ground level. And in some places, ropes are used just to safely move up and down the trail between the water and the top of the peninsula. That's in daylight with full awareness. Now, take that same environment and remove the light. Now add alcohol. And then take your shoes off, because Lauren's shoes were found under her hammock, which means any movement away from that area would have had to have been barefoot. And that's important because barefoot movement really changes how people move. They move slower, much more deliberately, more cautious. They don't move faster. They're not careless. They're not blind. So when you start looking at the scene, you're not just asking, could someone fall? Because the answer to that is very simply yes. The question, though, becomes, how do you get to the point where that fall happens? And does the environment support any kind of a path of movement that answers that question, at least in the way that it's been described? So at a high level, the explanation for Lauren Agee's death is very straightforward. She went to a lake and she spent the night with friends, and they were drinking, and quite a lot from what I understand. And at some point, she fell from that campsite into the water below. Her death, like I said, was ruled an accident. The noted cause of death was blunt force trauma to the head and the back, with a possible contributing factor of drowning. Like we said, on the surface, that explanation makes perfect sense because the environment is obviously dangerous. I sure as a shit wouldn't camp there. The drop is very real, and the area where they were staying was directly above that cliff. The hammocks that they were sleeping in were positioned right near the edge. So, like I said before, the idea that someone could fall from that location is not at all unrealistic. It's very possible. But possibility is not the same as an explanation that makes sense, because once you move past that initial step, the questions don't go away. They multiply exponentially. If Lauren fell from that location directly into the water, then you would expect a very specific outcome. A clean entry with minimal external injuries, or injuries that are at least consistent with that type of an impact. But that is not what we see. If she didn't fall cleanly, then something changes, because now you have to explain what she hit and how before she reached the water. And that introduces a different set of problems, because that side of the cliff, like I said, is known for cliff jumping. People were jumping there throughout that weekend. Her friends, at least, were jumping there. And some would claim that Lauren herself was jumping there. So that suggests a very clear path into the water. Nobody's going to cliff jump through brush and trees and over rocks. So now we're dealing with a contradiction. Either one, it's a clean drop, or two, there are obstacles that will cause injury. But both don't fit cleanly at the same time. And even beyond that, there's still unanswered questions. Why did she leave the hammock at all? Without her shoes, in the dark, after drinking? And if she did fall, how does that fall lead to where she was ultimately found? Because the explanation doesn't just stop at the fall. It has to account for everything that comes after that. And right now, those steps are not clearly defined. So again, we're not saying that the explanation is wrong. We're asking whether it's complete or not. Because if it's accurate, it should be able to explain the fall, the injuries, and Lauren's final location as one continuous sequence. And so that's what we're going to test piece by piece as we move forward. So up to this point, we've been looking at the physical side of the case, the terrain, the position of the campsite, and what the official explanation requires from a physical standpoint. But now we have to place all of this inside of time, because in this case, there's a very clear dividing line, a point where the timeline shifts from something that we can verify to something we can't, and we're just being told. At approximately 2 a.m., Lauren Agee is seen alive. She's at the marina at Fish Lips, and she is seen by an off-duty sheriff's deputy. So we're not talking about being seen by somebody that has also spent the night drinking. We're talking about somebody that was employed to work security and is in law enforcement himself. So it's a very credible witness, especially compared to the other people that weekend. And this is not at all attacking people for going to a lake and having a good time and drinking. It is just merely pointing out that this particular witness was in a position of employment that required him to be closely monitoring the situation. So his description carries a lot of credence. And he sees her leaving with the same three people that she arrived with: Hannah Palmer, Aaron Lilly, and Chris Stout. All four of them walk down the dock together. That moment is the last independently confirmed sighting of Lauren that we have of Lauren alive. After that, there are no independent timestamps, no third-party sightings, no verification of where Lauren is or what she's doing. Everything that comes after comes from the statements of the three people that she was with. And that's important because now the timeline changes. Before 2 a.m., we have evidence, we have corroboration, we have dependable third-party witnesses that have nothing to gain, are not part of this story. After 2 a.m., we have a narrative. Now, according to those statements, the group leaves the marina, gets back onto the water in their canoe, and returns to their campsite. They make their way back up to the area where they're staying. And at some point, they go to sleep. And when they do, Lauren is still there, apparently sleeping in the hammock with Chris Stout. There is a sequence, at least as it's been described, but even within that sequence, there's inconsistencies, because not every account places everyone in the same location at the same time. We have statements that suggest that Chris Stout was not with the group when they left the marina, that he may have already been somewhere else on a houseboat, while other accounts place all four of them together leaving at the same time. So those details don't line up cleanly. And while we're not going to break that down here and now, it is important to recognize that even at the very beginning of this timeline, there are differences in how it's being described. Now, from this point forward, every step of the official explanation depends on that timeline being accurate, that she was alive at that location after 2 a.m., and that whatever happened after that point. But without some kind of independent verification, those are not established facts. They are statements. And statements, especially when they come from the same small group of people, have to be tested. They cannot just be assumed. And so this is where the case changes, because now we're no longer working with confirmed events. We're working with one version of events. And the strength of everything that follows depends on whether that version holds up or not. So once the timeline shifts from what we can verify to what we're being told, then the next step is simple. You start looking for anything that maybe doesn't line up. Not conclusions and not theories, just points of friction. And in this case, those show up pretty quickly. When Lauren is gone, her belongings are still there at the campsite. Her shoes, her personal items, and very importantly, her phone, left at the campsite. Now, that's important because regardless of what explanation that you're working from, that is not neutral. It tells you something about the movement. If she left, then she chose to leave without those items. If she fell, then she fell without them. But either way, it becomes part of the sequence that has to be explained. And the phone really deserves its own focus because for someone her age, that's not just some other item. It's not a sweatshirt. It is her means of communication, her awareness. But most importantly, in this environment, it is really the most common light source that we've all come accustomed to using. I don't know anybody that in a situation like this doesn't just turn the flashlight on their phone. It's what we've all become accustomed to. So if she got up in the dark and intended to move anywhere, even a very short distance, the most natural thing to take would be her phone. Not because she planned something, not because she had somebody to call or to text, but because that is how people move anymore, especially in the dark. They use it to see, to navigate, to orient themselves. So finding that phone left behind doesn't prove anything on its own, but behaviorally, it just doesn't align cleanly with the idea that she intentionally left that area to go anywhere else, especially not in the dark, especially not barefoot, because those shoes add yet another layer. Any movement away from that area would have had to have been barefoot, in the dark, after drinking, in terrain that we have already established is uneven, unstable, covered with rocks, with sticks, with leaves, with branches, with all kinds of shit that's going to tear your feet up. Again, it doesn't make movement impossible, but it changes how that movement would happen for sure. She would definitely be moving slower, more deliberate, more cautious. And when you combine that with the phone left behind, it creates a version of movement that becomes harder to reconcile with the explanations that are being offered. And her shoes were directly under her hammock and they're flip-flops. If she did get up, why wouldn't she slip them on to do anything? It makes no sense. And then we move forward to the next part of the timeline. Lauren is gone. At some point, that is recognized by the group. But the response does not match what you would expect. There's no immediate report. There's no documented escalation of any kind. No clear indication of urgency. Instead, the day continues normally. Movement between the campsite and the lake, drinking starting early, partying all day, activity that is consistent with everything else happening that weekend. And that's the part that really stands out to me because there are statements that suggest they were concerned when they woke up, that Lauren may have gotten up and gone towards the edge and that something could have happened. She may have fallen when she went to pee, but that supposed concern doesn't translate into any kind of action. And when those two things don't match, it becomes something that you absolutely have to account for. Now, none of these things that we've talked about so far on their own prove anything, but they're also not random. They are points where the sequence we've been given starts to encounter resistance, where simple explanations start requiring additional assumptions. And as those assumptions stack up, the explanation becomes more fragile because now we've identified a break in the timeline, inconsistencies in how it's being described, and behavior that does not align with the situation. So the next step is to take those pieces and place them directly against the evidence because At some point, the story has to meet the reality of what actually happened. So far, we've been looking at the scene, and we looked at the timeline, and we took a brief look at the statements. So now we have to look at the one place where all of this is supposed to come together and make perfect sense, because it's the one place where it's supposed to be completely objective. Subjectivity should not come into this piece of the puzzle at all. That is the autopsy. Because regardless of what anyone says happened, the medical findings should tell us how she died. The official cause of death is listed as blunt force trauma to the head and back, with a possible contributing factor of drowning. And the manner of death is ruled as an accident. So on the surface, it sounds complete, but when we look closer, it raises some important questions. Blunt force trauma is not a specific injury. It's a category of injuries. It tells you that some kind of impact occurred, but it doesn't tell you where that impact occurred, what structure was damaged, or what specifically caused death. In cases where blunt force trauma is fatal, you typically see defined findings, fractures, internal bleeding, structural damage, something that clearly explains how that trauma resulted in death. Here, that level of detail is not clearly established. Now add the second part, possible drowning. That language is very important because possible is not confirmation. It means there isn't enough evidence to clearly establish that drowning occurred. So that distinction is important, because if drowning cannot be clearly established, then it cannot be relied on as the primary explanation. So then when we step back and we look at these findings as a whole, we're left with something very unusual. We have a conclusion, but we have not clearly defined any sort of mechanism. We have a broad category of injury, a possible contributing factor, and a final ruling. But what we don't have is any kind of a step-by-step medical explanation that connects any of those pieces together. And that matters because the role of an autopsy is not just to label a death. It is to explain it. This doesn't tell us what happened, but it does tell us what we don't have. We don't have a clearly defined medical sequence that explains how her injuries occurred, how those injuries led to her death, and whether drowning played a role at all or not. And without that, the explanation that we've been given has way less support than it appears to at first glance, because now we're not just dealing with a break in the timeline or inconsistencies in the statements. We're also dealing with a very clear lack of clarity at the medical level. Before we keep going, I want to take a second to talk about something that matters beyond the episode itself. At Dark Dialogue, we've built something called the Adopt a Victim program. The goal is simple: to keep attention on the victims themselves, not just the case, and find answers for those stories without them. Because once the headlines fade, most people are forgotten. This is one way to make sure that that doesn't happen. If that's something that you want to be a part of, you can find it on the website along with the rest of the Dark Dialogue network. All right, so let's get back into this. So when you take everything that we've looked at so far and you put it all together, then the next step is to test whether the explanation that's been given actually holds up in any real way when we walk through it in detail. So throughout this episode, we've identified the pieces: the scene, the timeline, the statements, and the limitations of the medical findings. So now We take the explanation that we've been given and slow it down. Not in broad terms, but step by step, because if it is accurate, it should hold together at every point along that sequence. So the sequence begins with Lauren waking up, not fully alert, not fully aware, but coming out of sleep in the middle of the night after drinking heavily. And that's important because waking up in that condition is not immediate. It takes time. It takes time to orient yourself, to understand where you are, to recognize your surroundings. And in this case, those surroundings really matter because she is not in a bedroom. She's not in a controlled space. She's in a hammock positioned near the edge of a cliff in a wooded area on uneven ground with very limited visibility. So the first thing that has to happen is some kind of awareness. From there, the explanation requires a decision to be made, a decision to get up, to leave that hammock and to move away from that point. And again, that is not impossible, but it does raise a question. Why? Not as a theory, but as part of the sequence, because movement, especially in that environment, usually has a purpose of some kind, even if it's a small one. To use the restroom, to adjust position, to check something nearby. But whatever that reason is, it becomes part of what has to be explained. So now she stands up, barefoot, in the dark, after drinking, without her phone, and begins to move in the dark. Not across a long distance, we would presume, but even a few steps in that environment matter because footing is not consistent, balance isn't stable, and visibility is very limited. So movement here is not automatic. It's cautious. It's deliberate. It's slow. And that's important because it affects how events unfold. Now, from there, the explanation brings her close to the edge of the cliff. Now, remember, this is not a wide open space. It's a very confined area with a very defined boundary where the ground ends and the drop begins. And so now we're at the point where a fall becomes a real possibility. Now, it's not guaranteed. It's certainly not inevitable, but it is possible. And that is the key distinction because for this explanation to hold, possibility has to become reality. So at some point, she goes over the edge from that position into the water below. And again, that can certainly happen. But now, everything that follows depends on how that fall occurs, because not all falls produce the same outcome. The angle, the body position, what is or what isn't contacted on the way down, all of that affects the result. And that result has to align with what we know as fact. So this is where the explanation reaches its first real test, because up to this point, we're dealing with possibility. From here on out, we are dealing with known outcomes, and outcomes have to match the evidence. So we've reached the point where the explanation moves from possibility to a known outcome. Lauren goes over the edge from that position into the water below. And from here, everything has to line up because what happens next is not theoretical. It is physical. If she falls from that height into deep water, there's only a few ways that any kind of an impact can occur. An entry into the water or contact with something before she enters the water. Those are fundamentally two very different outcomes. One is a clean entry. Typically, that would result in very minimal external injury because water absorbs the force, especially in an area where people are actively cliff jumping. But if there's contact on the way down with a rock, with a tree, with some structure, well, then that changes everything. Now you're dealing with impact points, abrasions, all kinds of potential for trauma. So the question becomes, which one are we looking at? Because the explanation, whatever it is, has to account for that. So now let's assume that she enters the water. At that point, there's only a couple possibilities. Either one, she falls into the water, she's conscious, she's able to move, or two, she's incapacitated. And those obviously lead to completely different outcomes. If she's conscious, then she can swim. And Lauren had worked as a lifeguard, so she could swim well. If she was conscious, she would have been able to swim, orient herself, move toward the shore. If she's not, then obviously she can't do any of those things. And whatever happens next depends entirely on that condition. But here's the problem. The medical findings do not clearly establish which of those is true. There's no clearly defined injury that explains immediate incapacitation. And there's no confirmed evidence that establishes drowning. So now the sequence has to continue without a defined state. From there, time becomes a factor because as soon as someone is in the water, what happens next is driven by movement, environment, and duration. If she is moving, that affects where she goes. If she's not, then external forces take over. And that brings us to the next step. Lauren's body is found in a cove area not too far from the campsite, and that location has to be explained because it is not enough to say that she fell. You have to explain how she got from the point she landed from that fall, the point she entered the water, to where she was eventually found. It has to fit into the same sequence. And that sequence has to account for direction of movement, distance, and the physical environment of the water. Because bodies don't just appear in a final location. They get there somehow through some sort of a process. And that process has to make sense. And it has to be consistent with everything that we know came before it. So now step back and look at the full chain. Waking up, moving, approaching that edge, falling, entering the water, and ending up where she's found. Each of those steps has to connect. And right now, there are multiple points where that connection is not clearly defined. Now, assume that she enters the water. At that point, there's only a couple of possibilities. It's not necessarily impossible, but it is not clearly explained. Now, this is not about speculation. It's about reconstruction. Because when an explanation is accurate, it should be possible to take the known elements and build a logical sequence that consistently leads to a known outcome, step by step, from where she was to where she was found. And at this point, that sequence cannot be clearly reconstructed, not from the available evidence, not in a way that accounts for the environment, the timeline, common human behavior, and the final location of her body, not without introducing gaps or assumptions that are not supported. And when an explanation depends on that, then it stops being a reconstruction and it becomes something else entirely. Because now we've taken that explanation and we walked it all the way through, step by step. And what we're left with is not a complete picture. It's a series of steps that do not fully connect. So the next step isn't just to guess, it's to go back to the timeline and to start breaking it down in detail, because if this sequence doesn't hold together, then we need to understand what actually does. Now, at the start of this episode, we laid out a very simple goal, not to tell a story, but to test one that's already been told, to take the explanation that we've been given and walk through it step by step. And so when we do that, certain things become clear. We can say that this environment is dangerous. The drop into the water is very real, and that fall from that location is very, very possible. Those things are not in question. But we cannot say clearly how that fall happened, and we can't define the exact sequence of events that led to it, and we can't point to any kind of medical finding that clearly explains how she died, and we cannot reconcile all of the statements into one consistent timeline. So what we're left with is not any kind of a complete explanation. What we're left with is a series of gaps. Gaps in the time, gaps in the sequence, gaps in how the physical evidence connects to the outcome, gaps in the statements. And when those gaps exist, the explanation depends on assumptions, not on any kind of reconstruction. And if this were just one case, that would be enough to take a closer look, but it's not, because we've seen something very similar before. Different cases, different circumstances, but the same kind of breakdown, where a conclusion is reached without a clearly defined path to support it. We saw that in Holly's case. We're seeing elements of it here. And we've seen elements of it in other investigations as well. Not as a claim and not as an accusation, but as a pattern that I'm beginning to see that really deserves to be examined. So now we're going to move forward, not by guessing, but by going deeper, back to the timeline, back to the statements, and we're going to break them down in detail. Because if the sequence that we've been given doesn't hold up, then we need to understand what actually does. So this is just the beginning of a much deeper analysis, because this case does not end with one explanation. And it may not be just about this one case. It's about understanding how these cases are investigated and what happens when critical questions go unanswered. If you want to support the show, if you want to support the network and help us continue this work, you can find us at darkdialogue.com. We're also on Patreon at Dark Dialogue Pod, on Coffee at Dark Dialogue, and on Substack at Dark Dialogue 1. Your support helps us stay independent and keep the focus where it belongs, which is on the evidence. Until next time, stay curious, keep digging, take care of yourself, watch out for each other. This has been your host, John, and this is Dark Dialogue Distilled.